The cold air bit at Elena's cheeks as she gazed out over the endless expanse of snow-covered peaks. The Swiss Alps stretched before her like a postcard come to life, their pristine beauty untouched by time. Beside her, Eric adjusted his goggles, his face lit with excitement. "Ready to conquer the slopes, Mrs. Bennet?" he asked, his voice buoyant. Elena forced a smile. "Always," she replied, though her chest felt heavy. The truth was she wasn't sure about being Mrs. Bennet. Their whirlwind romance had swept her off her feet, Eric's charm, his stability, his unwavering devotion. But now, weeks into their marriage, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was missing. She loved him, but it felt shallow, fragile, like the snow beneath their skis, beautiful but prone to melting under the wrong conditions. Their first few runs down the mountain were exhilarating, Eric laughing as he raced her, always slowing just enough to let her win. But on their final descent, a wrong turn sent him tumbling. The sound of his cry cut through the crisp air like a jagged edge. By the time Elena reached him, his leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. The medics came quickly, their efficiency a stark contrast to the panic Elena felt. Hours later, Eric was confined to their chalet, his leg in a cast, his adventurous spirit dulled. "You should go out," he urged that evening, his voice laced with pain but filled with sincerity. "Enjoy yourself. No reason for both of us to be stuck." She hesitated but eventually agreed, guilt mixing with relief as she left the warmth of the chalet and ventured into the icy night. The bar she found was small and lively, a haven of warmth amidst the snow. She ordered a glass of wine and sat by the fire, letting the noise of strangers wash over her. That's when she saw him, a young man, no more than 21, leaning casually against the bar. His sharp features, messy hair, and easy confidence were a stark contrast to Eric's polished demeanour. When their eyes met, he smiled, a hint of mischief in his gaze, and for the first time in weeks, Elena felt something stir. The young man's smile lingered as he walked over, his movements unhurried, as though he knew exactly how to command the room. Elena shifted in her seat, feeling both out of place and inexplicably drawn to him. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his accent distinctly American, his voice warm and inviting. She hesitated, her fingers brushing the stem of her wineglass. "Sure," she said finally, gesturing to the seat across from her. "I'm Jake," he said, leaning forward slightly, his blue eyes catching the firelight. "Elena," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "You're not from around here," he said, his grin teasing. "Let me guess. Honeymooning in the Alps?" She blinked, surprised at his accuracy. "How did you know?" Jake shrugged. "You've got that look." "What look?" He tilted his head, studying her. "The one that says, this was supposed to be perfect, but something feels off." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. Elena opened her mouth to respond, to deny it, but the truth was written all over her face, and Jake seemed to know it. "I didn't mean to pry," he added quickly, his tone softening. "It's just something I've seen before." Elena exhaled, letting the tension in her shoulders ease. "You're not wrong," she'd admitted, surprising herself. "It's been complicated." Jake raised his glass of whiskey in a silent toast. "To complications, then?" She laughed, a real laugh, and clinked her glass against his. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of release, as if she could breathe again. They talked easily, Jake telling her about his road trip through Europe and how he was chasing stories for a travel blog he hoped to turn into a career. He was bold, curious, and disarmingly honest, a stark contrast to the measured practicality of Eric. As the conversation flowed, so did the wine, and before long, the warmth between them became something more than just friendly. Jake's gaze lingered, his fingers brushing hers as he reached for his glass. "What are you running from, Elena?" he asked softly. The question hung in the air, daring her to answer. Elena stared at Jake, the weight of his question pressing against her chest. "What am I running from?" It was a question she hadn't let herself ask. Not during the whirlwind romance with Eric, not during the rushed wedding, and certainly not as they boarded the plane to Switzerland. But now, sitting across from a stranger with eyes that seemed to see too much, she couldn't ignore it. She took a sip of her wine, her hand trembling slightly. "I'm not sure," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe. Myself." Jake leaned back, watching her with a quiet intensity. "That's a tough one to escape," he said. "Wherever you go, there you are. Elena let out a humorless laugh. That's the problem, isn't it? Silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the low murmur of other conversations. Jake didn't push, didn't pry further. Instead, he waited, giving her the space to speak if she wanted to. And somehow, that made her want to. I love Eric, she said eventually, her words careful, as if testing their truth. He's kind, dependable, everything I thought I wanted. But sometimes, I wonder if I married him because it felt safe, because it was the right thing to do. Jake's brow furrowed slightly. And now you're wondering if right is enough, she nodded, surprised by how easily he had put her feelings into words. He deserves someone who doesn't have to wonder. Jake's gaze softened. Maybe, but you also deserve to feel alive. The words hung in the air, heavier than the snow outside. Elena felt her pulse quicken, a mix of guilt and something she couldn't quite name. Before she could respond, Jake leaned closer, his voice low. What would you do if you weren't afraid, if there were no rules, no expectations? The question sent a shiver down her spine, one that wasn't from the cold. She opened her mouth, searching for an answer, but nothing came. Instead, she felt the space between them shrink, the firelight reflecting in his eyes, and for a moment the rest of the world seemed to disappear. Elena's breath caught as the space between them felt charged, fragile, as though one wrong move could shatter it. Jake's question echoed in her mind. What would you do if you weren't afraid? It was a question she'd never dared to ask herself, let alone answer. And now, here she was, staring into the eyes of a man who seemed to embody freedom, freedom from her own carefully constructed life. She finally found her voice, shaky but resolute. I'd stop pretending. Jake's gaze didn't waver, his expression unreadable. Pretending what? That I'm happy the way things are, she admitted, her chest tightening with the weight of her words. That love is enough when it feels incomplete. His eyes searched hers, but he didn't speak. Instead, he reached across the table and brushed his fingers lightly over the back of her hand. The touch was electric, and for a moment Elena forgot everything. Eric, the chalet, the life she'd built piece by piece with someone she wasn't sure she truly knew. You deserve more than incomplete, Jake said softly, more than safe. The words hit her with a force she hadn't expected. Safe. That was what Eric was, steady, reliable, predictable, and she'd clung to that steadiness, convincing herself it was enough. But now, as she sat across from Jake, she felt the edges of her carefully curated life fraying. I can't, she started, pulling her hand away and clutching her wineglass like a lifeline. This isn't fair to Eric. He doesn't deserve this. Jake leaned back, his expression thoughtful but calm. You're right. He doesn't, but he also doesn't deserve to be with someone who's questioning everything. Her throat tightened. I don't know how to stop. Jake shrugged, his smile tinged with sadness. Maybe you don't. Maybe you figure it out one step at a time. But whatever you do, don't lie to yourself, Elena. That's where it all starts. The weight of his words hung heavy between them. For the first time, she realized the decision wasn't just about Eric or Jake. It was about her. What kind of life she wanted, what kind of love she could give. The question now was she brave enough to find out? Elena left the bar that night with her thoughts tangled in a mess of guilt, longing, and uncertainty. The cold air stung her cheeks as she walked back to the chalet, her breath forming clouds in the crisp night. Her mind replayed Jake's words, his touch, the way he seemed to see through the walls she'd spent years building. When she reached the door of the chalet, she hesitated, her hand resting on the handle. Inside was the man who had vowed to love her, to build a life with her. She'd made that same promise. Yet tonight she had strayed, if not physically, then emotionally, and the weight of it crushed her. She opened the door quietly. Eric was asleep on the couch, his cast propped up on a pillow, a book resting open on his chest. The sight of him filled her with a pang of something familiar and bittersweet. He had always been steady, her constant in a world that often felt too chaotic. But now, as she stood there, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was betraying both of them by staying silent. The next morning, Eric woke to find Elena sitting at the window, wrapped in a blanket and staring out at the snowy peaks. Morning, he said groggily, shifting in discomfort as his injured leg reminded him of its presence. She turned, offering him a small smile. Morning, he frowned. You didn't sleep much, did you? No, she admitted, her voice soft. I've been thinking. Eric's expression shifted, concern flickering in his eyes. About what? Elena hesitated, her heart pounding. She could hear Jake's words echoing in her mind. Don't lie to yourself. Taking a deep breath, she finally spoke. Eric, I need to be honest with you, she said, her voice trembling but firm. About us. About how I feel. His face fell and the room felt impossibly still. I love you, she continued, tears pooling in her eyes. But something's missing, and I don't think pretending is fair to either of us. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of the wind outside. Eric stared at her, his face a mixture of confusion and pain. For a moment, Elena thought he might try to dismiss her words, to tell her she was overthinking or tired, but instead he let out a slow breath and leaned back against the couch, his eyes clouded with thought. You don't think this is enough, he said finally, his voice quiet. Elena swallowed hard, guilt pressing against her chest. It's not that you're not enough, Eric. It's me. I thought I was ready for this, but the truth is, I don't know if I'm giving you the kind of love you deserve. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. And when did you start feeling this way? She hesitated, unsure how much of the truth he could bear. It's been in the back of my mind for a while, she admitted. But this trip, it's made me face things I've been avoiding. I can't keep pretending everything is perfect when it's not. Eric looked down at his cast, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You're talking about more than just skiing, aren't you? Elena blinked, surprised by his perceptiveness. Yes. For a long moment they sat in silence. The air between them felt heavy, charged with unsaid words. Finally, Eric looked up, his expression steady but pained. I always knew you were hesitant, Elena. I just thought if I loved you enough, you'd feel it too. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I do feel it, Eric. I just don't think it's the same as what you feel for me, and that's not fair to you. Eric's shoulders slumped and he let out a shaky breath. So what happens now? Elena felt her heart breaking as she spoke. I think we need to step back, to figure out what we really want apart. He closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded. I don't want to lose you, Elena, but I don't want you to stay if it's not real. His words were a release and a wound all at once. As the snow fell outside, Elena realised that love, no matter how beautiful, wasn't always enough, and sometimes letting go was the truest act of love there was. The next few days passed in a haze of quiet conversations and shared silences. The chalet, once a cosy retreat, now felt like a space filled with unspoken truths. Elena helped Eric with his daily tasks, their interactions polite but distant. It was as if they were both waiting for the inevitable goodbye, but unsure how to begin it. On their last evening in Switzerland, Elena sat on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket as the sun set behind the peaks. The mountains glowed with a soft golden light, and for the first time since their conversation, she felt the tension in her chest loosen. Eric joined her, hobbling on crutches. He lowered himself into the chair beside her with a grunt, his face etched with exhaustion. You always loved the sunsets, he said, his voice warm despite the distance between them. They're beautiful here, she replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Everything feels so still. Eric nodded, the silence between them now more reflective than strained. After a moment, he spoke again. I've been thinking about what you said. She turned to him, her heart tightening. Eric, I never wanted to hurt you. I know, he said quickly, and I think that's what makes this so hard. I keep wishing I could fix it, us, but deep down I know it's not something I can fix. It's something we both have to figure out. His words struck her like a gentle blow, filled with understanding she hadn't expected. You deserve someone who feels certain, Eric, she said softly, and so do I. He looked at her, his eyes glistening. I loved you enough to believe that would be enough, but maybe love needs more than just love. She reached over, taking his hand in hers. I'll always care for you. That won't change. I know, he said, squeezing her hand, but it's time we both start finding what we really need. The sun disappeared behind the mountains, leaving only a faint glow in its wake. As the darkness settled, Elena realised that, though the ending was bittersweet, it was also a beginning for both of them. The flight back to reality was quieter than either of them expected. Eric stared out the window, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest of his seat. Elena, seated beside him, watched the clouds stretch across the endless sky. her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. They'd said everything that needed to be said, and yet the silence between them felt more final than any conversation ever could. When they landed, Eric insisted on calling a cab to take them home. Elena offered to help him, but he shook his head gently. "I'll manage," he said with a faint smile. "I think we both need some time." She nodded, her throat tight. "Let me know when you get home." "I will," he promised. Then, as the cab pulled up, he hesitated, looking back at her. "Elena, I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." His words carried no malice, only a quiet, genuine wish. She blinked back tears, managing a small smile. "You too, Eric." He got into the cab, and as it drove away, Elena stood there, feeling the weight of the moment pressed down on her. It wasn't until the taillights disappeared into the distance that she finally turned and began walking. In the days that followed, Elena moved into a friend's spare room. The small space was a stark contrast to the life she'd built with Eric, but it felt right, simple, unburdened. She spent her time reading, walking through the city, and sitting in cafes, letting herself exist without the pressure of being anyone's wife or saviour. One afternoon, as she wandered through a park, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Eric. "Got the cast off today. Feels weird not having it. Hope you're doing okay." She smiled faintly, typing back. "Glad to hear it. I'm okay. One step at a time, right?" As she sent the message, she felt a strange peace settle over her. Love, she realised, wasn't always about holding on. Sometimes it was about letting go, making space for something new, something unknown. And for the first time in years, she was ready to face it. Alone, but hopeful. Months passed, and the snow that had once defined their trip melted into memory. Spring bloomed around Elena in gentle greens and soft petals, a reflection of the quiet growth happening within her. Life moved forward in ways she hadn't anticipated, though some mornings she still woke with a hollow ache, memories of Eric lingering like faint echoes. They kept in touch sporadically, short messages here and there. Eric sent updates about his recovery, shared small victories like hiking his first trail since the accident. Elena responded with words of encouragement, keeping her own updates brief, unsure how to articulate the changes she was experiencing. One evening, as she sat at a cafe flipping through a book she couldn't quite focus on, a familiar voice broke through her thoughts. "Elena?" She looked up, startled, and there he was, Jake. His hair was longer, his backpack slung casually over one shoulder, and his face was lit with surprise. "I can't believe it's you." She blinked, caught off guard by the rush of memories his presence brought. "Jake," she said slowly, standing to greet him. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," he said with a laugh, pulling a chair to her table without waiting for an invitation. "I thought you'd still be in Switzerland or, I don't know, settled somewhere." She hesitated, unsure how to explain. "Things didn't work out the way I thought they would." His smile softened. "That doesn't sound like a bad thing." "It wasn't," she admitted, surprised by how easily the truth came. "It just took time to see it that way." Jake leaned back, his easy confidence unchanged. "So what now? You writing the next chapter?" Elena studied him for a moment, then smiled. "I think so. Slowly." "You've got that look again," he teased, "like you're ready to take a leap but scared you might fall." She laughed, the sound light and free. Maybe this time, falling wouldn't be so bad. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they talked, the city's bustle fading into the background. For Elena, it wasn't about Jake, it was about the freedom to explore her own story, one page at a time. As the conversation with Jake flowed effortlessly, Elena began to feel a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in months. Excitement, not the fleeting, uncertain kind she'd felt during their first encounter, but a deeper, steadier kind that hinted at the possibility of a new chapter. But then, just as Jake leaned forward to say something, Elena's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was a number she didn't recognize, but the message made her heart stop. "Elena, it's Eric. Please call me." "It's urgent." Her stomach churned. Eric never used that tone, not even when they'd parted ways. Jake noticed her change in expression and tilted his head. "Everything okay?" I don't know," she said, rising from her chair. "I need to take this." She stepped outside the cafe, the cool evening air sharp against her flushed skin. With trembling hands, she dialed the number. It rang once before Eric's voice came through. breathless and hurried. "Elena," he said, his tone strained. "Thank God you called." "What's going on?" she asked, her voice edged with worry. There was a pause. Then Eric spoke carefully. "I think someone's been following me." "What?" Elena's voice rose in disbelief. "Eric, what are you talking about?" "For the past week," he explained, his voice tight with tension, "I've noticed this man. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, seeing him at the grocery store, the park, even outside my building. But today he was waiting outside my office." Elena gripped her phone tightly. "Did you call the police?" "I did," Eric replied. "They're looking into it, but I don't know, Elena. Something doesn't feel right." Before she could respond, Eric's voice dropped to a whisper. "And there's one more thing. Before I left the office today, I found a note in my car. It said, 'You don't deserve her.'" Elena's blood ran cold. "Eric, are you safe now?" "I think so," he said, but his voice betrayed his fear. I thought you should know." Elena hung up, her mind racing. A chill ran down her spine. Somewhere, someone was watching, and it wasn't over. Elena's heart pounded as she stood on the sidewalk, the phone still clutched in her hand. The chill of the evening air was nothing compared to the icy dread spreading through her chest. She turned back toward the cafe, her thoughts spinning. Who would do something like this? And why? Jake appeared at the doorway, his brows furrowed as he stepped closer. "Hey, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." She hesitated, unsure how much to tell him. He had no connection to this, and dragging him into the tangled mess of her past felt unfair. But when a voice came, it betrayed her fear. "Eric, he's in trouble. Someone's been following him." Jake frowned, his concern deepening. "Following him? Do you know who?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "But it's serious. He found a note. It mentioned me." Jake's jaw tightened, his carefree demeanor replaced by something sharper. "What did it say?" Elena hesitated, then repeated the words, "You don't deserve her." Jake's expression darkened, his shoulders tensing. "That's not random. Whoever this is, they're making it personal." The weight of the situation pressed down on her. The note wasn't just a threat to Eric. It was a connection to her, to their shared history. Was someone trying to punish him for the marriage, or for how it ended? The possibilities made her stomach churn. "I need to call him back," she muttered, turning away to redial Eric's number. But as the line rang, a shadow moved at the edge of her vision. She froze, glancing down the street. "Jake?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Did you see that?" He followed her gaze, his posture immediately alert. "What?" "There." She pointed toward the corner where a figure had been standing moments ago. The man was gone now, but she was certain she'd seen someone, a tall figure in a dark coat, just watching. Jake stepped closer to her, his eyes scanning the street. "Let's get out of here," he said firmly. "We'll figure this out, but not here." Elena nodded, her pulse racing. Whoever was out there, it felt like they weren't done, and she had no idea how far they would go. Jake led Elena away from the cafe, his hand brushing hers as they walked quickly through the quiet streets. The tension in the air was palpable, but his steady presence grounded her. When they reached a secluded park tucked between rows of townhouses, he stopped, turning to face her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with concern. His blue eyes searched hers, looking for answers she didn't yet have. Elena shook her head, her breath unsteady. "I don't know. Everything feels wrong, like this isn't just about Eric or me, but something bigger." Jake reached out, his fingers lightly grazing her arm. "Hey," he said gently, "you're not alone in this. Whatever's going on, we'll figure it out." His words were simple, but the way he said them, so sincere, so unwavering, made her chest tighten. She looked up at him, and for the first time that night, she felt a flicker of calm amidst the chaos. "You don't have to do this, you know?" she said quietly. "You barely know me. This isn't your problem." Jake's expression softened, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Elena, I think we both know it stopped being just your problem the moment I walked back into your life." She laughed despite herself, the sound carrying a mix of relief and disbelief. "You make it sound like fate." "Maybe it is," he replied, his tone playful, but his gaze serious. "Or maybe I just like the way I feel when I'm around you. Either way, I'm not going anywhere." His words hit her like a wave, breaking the fear and confusion that had gripped her all night. Without thinking, she stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jake?" I don't know where this is going. Neither do I, he admitted, his hand moving to hers, his touch gentle but firm. But I know I'd rather face it with you than without you. Before she could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that felt both urgent and tender. In that moment, the shadows of her past faded, leaving only the warmth of Jake's presence and the promise of something new. The kiss lingered, soft yet electric, as if the world around them had momentarily paused. Elena's mind raced, her emotions tangled in a whirlwind of fear, guilt, and desire. When they finally pulled apart, Jake's eyes searched hers, his breath warm in the crisp night air. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I didn't mean to." "No," she interrupted, shaking her head as a flush crept across her cheeks. "Don't apologize. I just—" She trailed off, unsure how to articulate the storm inside her. Jake stepped back slightly, giving her space, but the look in his eyes remained steady. "Elena, I know this is messy. I know you're dealing with things I can't fully understand, but I meant what I said. I'm here. Whatever you're feeling, whatever you're going through, you don't have to face it alone." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. She wanted to believe him, to let herself fall into the comfort he offered. But part of her couldn't shake the shadow of Eric, the unanswered questions, the danger that seemed to be closing in around her. "Jake, this isn't just complicated," she said, her voice trembling. "Someone's targeting Eric and it's tied to me. I don't even know how to protect myself, let alone drag you into this." Jake reached for her hand, his touch warm against the chill of her skin. "I'm not afraid of complicated," he said, "and I'm not afraid of whatever this is. If someone's after you, we'll figure it out. Together." Tears welled in her eyes and she quickly looked away, embarrassed by her vulnerability. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not simple," he admitted, stepping closer again, "but you're worth it." She turned back to him, her gaze locking with his. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she wasn't carrying the weight of everything alone. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. Both of them froze. She pulled it from her pocket, her breath catching as she read the message. "You can't protect him or yourself." Her blood ran cold. This wasn't over, not even close. Elena stared at the cryptic message on her phone, her heart pounding in her chest. The tension in the air was thick, and Jake stood by her side, his expression a mix of concern and determination. Before she could fully process the implications, her phone buzzed again. Another message, this one even more chilling. "We're all closer than you think." "What the hell does that mean?" Jake asked, leaning over her shoulder. As if on cue, the distant crunch of footsteps echoed through the park. Elena turned, her stomach twisting into knots as 5 figures emerged from the shadows, each one achingly familiar. First was Adam, the brooding artist she had dated in her early 20s. His piercing eyes were just as intense as she remembered, though now they carried a sharper edge. "Elena," he said, his voice low and unreadable. "It's been a while." Beside him stood Sophia, her first and only experiment with dating another woman. Sophia had always been unpredictable, her fiery personality matched by her striking red hair. "Still managing to complicate everything, I see," Sophia said with a smirk, though her tone held an undercurrent of something darker. Behind them, Marcus, the charming traveller who had stolen her heart one summer in Greece, adjusted his scarf. He looked at her with an almost nostalgic sadness. "You've always been good at running away," he said softly. To his right, Anthony, the corporate lawyer who had once promised her stability, crossed his arms, his tailored coat a stark contrast to the casual demeanour of the others. "I told you love wasn't enough for you, didn't I?" he said, his tone clipped. Finally, from the shadows stepped Liam, the quiet writer whose heart she had broken. He carried a notebook in his hand, his gaze heavy with unspoken words. It's strange seeing you again like this," he murmured. "I always wondered if you'd come back into my life." Elena's breath caught as she faced them all, the weight of her past crashing down on her like an avalanche. Jake stepped closer, his voice tense. "Elena, who are these people?" Her voice shook. They're my exes. And they weren't here by coincidence." Elena's mind raced as she stared at the 5 figures standing before her, each one a ghost from her past brought to life in the most surreal way possible. The air seemed to thrum with tension, the kind that could snap at any moment. "You all just happened to show up here?" she asked, her voice shaking. She didn't believe it, not for a second. Adam, the artist, crossed his arms, his lips curving into a sardonic smile. Do you really think this is a coincidence? You don't leave lives untouched, Elena. You leave marks. Big ones. Marks? Jake interjected, stepping forward protectively. What the hell does that even mean? Who are you people? Sophia tilted her head, her fiery red hair catching the faint light. We're the ones she walked away from, she said, her voice laced with sharp amusement. The ones she left behind while searching for whatever it is you're looking for now, Elena. Stop, Elena said, holding up a hand, her voice firmer than she felt. I don't know why you're here, but I can't believe you all just happened to show up in the same place. Someone made this happen. Liam, the quiet writer, stepped forward, his notebook clutched tightly in his hand. You're right, it wasn't an accident. We were brought together. Elena's stomach twisted. Brought together? By who? Marcus, the traveller, gave her a sad smile. Who do you think? Someone who knows you better than anyone else ever could. The realization hit her like a blow. Eric, she whispered, her breath catching. He did this? Sophia laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. Oh, Eric didn't do this. He just opened the door. He shared his pain, and it turns out he wasn't the only one left wondering what went wrong with you, Elena. Elena's knees felt weak, the world spinning around her. Jake grabbed her arm to steady her, his face a mask of confusion and concern. This is insane, he said. Why would Eric, or any of you, go to these lengths? Adam's eyes darkened. Because we all deserve answers. And tonight, Sophia added, her voice chillingly calm, you're going to give them to us. The tension hung heavy in the air as the 5 X's formed a loose semicircle around Elena, each of them radiating unresolved emotions. Jake glanced nervously at her, his protective stance unwavering. The silence was broken not with words, but with the haunting hum of Adam's voice. Elena, oh Elena, the woman who walks away! Adam stepped forward, his piercing gaze locked on hers. He gestured dramatically as he sang, his voice raw and deep. You leave behind a trail of hearts, but never choose to stay. Sophia, ever theatrical, stepped in with a bold, jazzy rhythm, her movements sharp and deliberate. She's a puzzle, a wildfire, a fleeting spark in the night. But when the flames burn out, oh love, she's already taken flight. Elena's eyes widened, her breath quickening. You've got to be kidding me, she muttered, but the music swelled around her, pulling her into their orchestrated chaos. Marcus joined with a wistful melody, his voice smooth and layered with regret. Elena, you were the summer breeze, the one I tried to hold. But seasons change, and there you went, leaving me in the cold. Anthony took centre stage next, his baritone commanding and precise. Love's a contract, a deal we sign with trust. But you broke the terms, Elena. You left us all in dust. The group swirled together in harmony, their voices rising like a choir of grievances, yet strangely beautiful. Oh, Elena, the wanderer, the dreamer who won't be bound. We gave you love, but you gave us silence, never turning around. Jake, completely baffled, finally interjected, his voice cutting through the harmony in a comically discordant but passionate burst. What the hell is happening here? I came for wine, not a Broadway sphere. The X's turned to him, their expressions intense but oddly amused. Together, they delivered a dramatic, synchronized response. You're in the story now, my friend. There's no way to disappear. Elena, overwhelmed, finally stepped forward, her voice trembling as she began to sing. You all think you know me, but you only saw a part. I gave pieces to each of you, but I've always kept my heart. The music swelled, the story unfolding in crescendos of confrontation, regret, and revelation. As the music crescendoed, the park became an impromptu stage, each X pouring their emotions into the melody. Elena stood at the centre, her heart-pound voice trembling but growing stronger with every note. The final confrontation was no longer just about them. It was about her reckoning with the pieces of herself she had left behind. I see your pain. I hear your cries. But loving me wasn't enough to make me realise. I was searching for something I couldn't define, and breaking hearts was breaking mine. Adam stepped forward, his tones softening as he sang. But why did you leave without a goodbye? Sophia joined, her fiery energy dimmed but still present. Did we mean so little that you wouldn't even try? Elena shook her head, her voice filled with emotion. It wasn't you. It was never you. It was me running, scared of what I couldn't do. The exes exchanged glances, their harmonies shifting from accusation to understanding. The melody softened, and Jake, still an outsider in this surreal performance, stepped in with an earnest solo. She's standing here, ready to face her past. But maybe the future is where her love will last. Elena turned to Jake, her voice steady now as she sang. Jake, you don't know the weight I bear. But you've been there, showing me you care. I can't promise forever. I don't know what's true, but I'll take this leap if it's with you. The music swelled, the exes joining in a final, triumphant harmony. Love isn't perfect, it's messy and raw, but facing the truth is the bravest thing of all. As the song ended, the exes stepped back, their expressions no longer bitter but resigned, even accepting. Adam spoke first, breaking the silence. We all deserved closure, and I think we finally got it. Sophia smirked. You'll always be a hurricane, Elena, but maybe you've found someone who can weather the storm. The group faded into the night, leaving Elena and Jake standing together. He took her hand, his smile gentle. Ready to write the next verse? She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. This time I won't run. And as they walked away, the stars seemed to shine a little brighter, their story just beginning.